Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. As you speak today, I'd like to know three things. What would you like to see happen up here with regards to the sediment issue? Secondly, who would it benefit? And third, who else would it benefit? This past Christmas, my oldest daughter gave me a gift, a present. It's a little bobblehead thing with Lucy and Charlie Brown. Lucy is holding the football, and Charlie Brown is ready to kick it. We all know what happens in that scenario. I've entitled this presentation Opportunity. And what you're probably wondering is this another Lucy and Charlie Brown scenario, where an opportunity is presented and at the last minute, the ball is taken away? With the introductions, with your experience, your passion, your interests, your background, I'm convinced that finally we're going to make some progress here. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes before Tim speaks about a little bit of background. I'm going to talk about our nation's reservoirs and this point, right? These two topics right now for just a couple of minutes. Later today, I'll talk about what can be done. So it's important to understand how dams in the United States have been built since the get-go. The first thing the engineers do is they say, what should the elevation be of the lowest outlet at the dam? They fix this elevation by estimating how much sediment will come into the reservoir during something called the design life. The design life is purely an economic principle. It has nothing to do with the longevity of the dam itself. Usually it's 50 or 100 years. So they estimate how much sediment will come into the reservoir during that time, and they conceptually put it on the bottom of the lake, and then they put their outlet right there. This practice has doomed all of the dams, almost all the dams in the United States, to be non-sustainable. Started out that first step, not the best. So that's how dams have been designed in the U.S. There's been a lot of dams built. Before the 1900s, there were almost 3,000 dams built in the U.S. This is the number of dams built in the U.S. by decade, and this information comes from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, if this economic design life, so to speak, is 50 years, then all the dams in the red box are older than their economic design life, which means that the reservoirs should be full up to that low-level outlet. But they're not. And that's because sediment doesn't go all the way down to the dam for the most part. It drops out as soon as it can, like here. Okay, here's the reality. So 65% of our dams down in the U.S., this is the big picture, were built more than 50 years ago. That 50 years is a common design life. I'll talk more about that later. And dead storage in most of the dams is not full because sediment drops out upstream. And because sediment drops out upstream, each one of you are here today. Okay, that's a little bit of intro. Now, more specifically to Gavins Point, closed in 1955, earth-fill and concrete dam about 75 feet high. I was out there last night. All but 2 spillway gates are open and discharging. Pretty impressive there at sunset. 450,000 acre-feet of storage. That's a lot of water. But nonetheless, it's the smallest of the 6 dams on the Missouri River. And when you go out and look at it, it looks huge. But it's the smallest of the 6. So, lots of history, and perhaps Tim can fill us in a little bit more. But the original site for Gavins Point Dam was upstream from the Niobrara River. And the Niobrara is the biggest contributor of sand. The next proposed point was at Gavins Point. Well, it wasn't built there either. It was put where it is right now. Now, all this sand from the Niobrara, Tim will go into detail about this, just drops out right there. The dead storage area in front of the dam, where all the sediment is supposed to go, relatively free and clear. So if you ask the Corps how much of the reservoir is filled, they'll say, oh my gosh, dead storage is looking great. But there's a lot going on up here, obviously. Now, that's only part of the picture. Here's who is not in the room today that really should be. Downstream, cities, NRDs, towns, counties. They've got a lot to complain about, too. There's been millions upon millions of dollars of damage downstream because the bed of the Missouri River has scoured up to 10 feet. And that's had dramatic impact on infrastructure and ecosystems. Why? Why? Tim will go into this. Why? Here's some of the silliness that results. Some of the silliness. We've got 2 endangered species downstream, least tern and piping plover. They like islands in the middle of a river to roost. There's no sand there. It's all up here. So what does the Corps do? They quarry sand, truck it, and put it in the river at a cost of millions of dollars. That's what law and policy requires. The least cost alternative to prevent jeopardy to endangered species. It does not fix the problem. So as we move forward here today, there's going to be 2 avenues. The main avenue that we'll be focused on is what can we do with this opportunity of a study to do a big project. But the other avenue is legal. And it will literally take an act of Congress, and I'll repeat this at the end of our meeting today, literally take an act of Congress to fix a couple things that are wrong. I think that just about does it for me. So, Tim, would you like to talk about the Niobrara then?
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Glad to see you. As Rollin said, I'm with the South Dakota Geological Survey and also an MSAC board member. What I want to talk to you a little bit about today is the history of how this problem developed, where the problem is coming from, and where it's going in the future if we don't do something about it. So we'll just start with a little bit about the actual location, which I think everybody in this room knows. But the thing I do want to point out is that we're really talking about a problem that's many, many miles long. It's not just at Springfield. It actually is a problem that extends beginning at the mouth of the Niobrara River, near the town of Niobrara, all the way down to Springfield, and at this point about 6 or 7 miles past Springfield, and that's getting longer and longer all the time. So it covers a very large area, and that's one of the reasons why we have both a lot of South Dakota people and a lot of Nebraska people in this room. We have the town in Niobrara, which is significantly impacted by the sedimentation problem, and we have the town of Springfield and everything in between. So what I'm going to cover briefly here is how has the delta evolved since Gavins Point Dam was built? Where does the sediment in the delta come from, which is important to know if we're going to pick the right solution? And how far will the delta migrate in the future, and what might it look like? So I have an executive summary, 1 slide. It's okay if you go to sleep during my presentation, that won't offend me, but just watch this 1 slide because I think it really tells the story first. So before Gavins Point Dam was built, we had a large natural free-flowing river that did what large natural rivers do. They meander from valley wall to valley wall. So the Missouri River meandered very consistently from across the entire floodplain all the way from Springfield down to Yankton, basically. It didn't have a sediment problem. It was carrying a large sediment load. But it was a different river back then, and if you talk to people that were alive before the Pick-Sloan plan was implemented, they will tell you that the Missouri River was a river to be feared. They did not know from one year to the other whether they would farm corn or catfish, as the saying goes. and they considered it to be a dangerous place. So everybody was really behind taming the Missouri River, and the Pick-Sloan Plan, the building of the 6 main stem dams, was part of taming of the Missouri River. So Gavins Point Dam was built. As Rollin said, it was closed off in 1955. That's when the actual river was shut off from flowing through it, and it was essentially tamed in this area. The reservoir behind the dam began to fill. I think it took about a year for it to fill up all the way back to Springfield. But what we had then was this nice, pristine lake called Lewis and Clark Lake that ran all the way back to Springfield and maybe about a mile or two just above Springfield. So this photo is from 1964. No sediment problem. Although I will tell you that some of the work we've looked at, or some of the data we've looked at, shows that there was a problem even by 1964 starting to develop underneath the water surface. And now we have what we have today. So as you can see, a large amount of that lake on the upstream end is now filled with sediment, and this is the sediment that continues to push further and further into the lake. So let's zoom in a little bit and look at the development of the problem around Springfield. So this is a 1941 photo. The dam hasn't begun construction yet. And you can see the river flowing freely by Springfield. You can see the big floodplain out here. There's sandbars and so on, but there's no sediment problem there. This is a 1964 photo. So again, we have the nice clear lake all the way up past Springfield. A little bit of remnant floodplain here, not the sediment problem. And then by 1984, it was becoming apparent there is a sediment problem. Really, in the 60s, it was building. I mean, essentially, as soon as that reservoir built, sediment started dropping out, but there was a lot of storage underneath the water surface for it initially. And it wasn't until the 1970s when it really started to show up above the surface of the water. And by the early 80s, it was clear that there was a sediment problem in this area. And then today, it looks like this. So the thing about these sediment problems is it's not something that just shows up overnight. And sometimes it's kind of a gray area. It creeps up slowly. And at first, people don't really realize we have a sediment problem. But then it starts to impact this. And then it impacts more things and more things. And then at some point, people realize, yeah, there's a problem. And that's where a lot of the people in this room and the people that preceded us, that's where they were at some time ago. They realized there's a problem. And that's sort of the root behind the formation of the Missouri Sedimentation Action Coalition to try to do something about that. I want to show you also what this does to the river underneath the water surface. So if I looked at the river at Springfield and drew a line across the river at Springfield here, it's interesting to see what it looked like underneath the water surface. Essentially, what did the riverbed look like in 1955 versus what it looks like today. So basically, what we're looking at is underneath that water surface, what's the profile of the riverbed look like across that red line? So this shows us what it looked like in 1955 when the dam was first closed off. The water surface is essentially this blue line here. This black line is what the riverbed looked like. So look at how deep the river was. You can see like where the main channel was and where a secondary channel was there at Springfield. It was a typical free-flowing Missouri River riverbed. Currently, basically in 2011, post-flood, it looks like this red line. So you can see that the riverbed has changed substantially, and a lot of the sediment is now above the water level, and that's the delta that you see. But look at how it's really completely filled in that riverbed in most places. And essentially what you see in yellow here, this yellow cover, that is all sediment that has filled in the riverbed since 1955. So it's done major changes to the riverbed, and this is just one cross-section, one example. You can go for miles and miles through that delta, and you'll see the same impact. So I want to show you a little bit about the movement of the delta. And I'll talk about this again a little bit later, but basically the delta moves at a certain rate, but it doesn't move uniformly. flows in the Missouri River significantly impact how much the delta moves in any given year. So here is a satellite image of the leading edge of the delta in 1996. So we're just downstream from Springfield a little ways. And you can see the leading edge right here of the delta. And this is 1998. So here's where it was on that 1996 image. And now you can see how far out it's pushed in 1998. This distance, by the way, is just short of a mile that it has pushed into the lake. Well, what happened in 1997? We had a very large flow event, extended flow event on the Missouri River. Gavins Point Dam was discharging about 70,000 cubic feet per second for the majority of the summer. So during that large flow event, this delta got pushed forward quite a ways. And that's the same thing happened in 2011 when we had 160,000 cubic feet per second for a good part of the summer coming out of Gavins Point Dam. We saw the same impact. So what are the sources of the sediment? Obviously the Niobrara River. You can see the confluence of the Niobrara and Missouri rivers right here. Here's the Missouri coming down, and here's the Niobrara River emptying into it. You can see this huge sediment load that comes in from the Niobrara River. My colleagues and I at the Missouri River Institute did a study a few years ago on this to try to back up some of the numbers that were being put out there in the reports and assign some actual numbers to the percentages of where the sediment's coming from, because there's more than just the Niobrara River out there to consider. So like most people know, as the result of our work, we found that the Niobrara contributes about 55% of the sediment to the delta each year. The Missouri River contributes about 36%. So it can also be a significant contributor to sediment in the delta. Everything else out there, though, we found was really insignificant. So all the other tributaries that one might wonder just how much comes from these, it's really insignificant. And part of the reason why is because they really just don't flow most of the year. There might be a short time during the year when they have decent flow in them, but most years they are just a trickle and not flowing enough to carry significant amounts of sediment into the delta system. So some facts about the delta. One is that the Niobrara and the Missouri River account for over 90% of the sediment that's accumulating in the delta. This is what I was talking about earlier with that little satellite imagery. The delta migrated downstream at an average rate of 400 feet per year from 1978 to 2012. So on average, it moves about a football field into the lake every year. But the high flows in the Missouri River are really what's causing it to move. And in 1997 and 2011, the delta actually moved about 4,800 feet further into the lake. So that's what's really making up that average. In a lot of years, the delta doesn't move much because the flows are low enough, but it's when we get these high flow years that it pushes it almost another mile into the lake, and that is very, very substantial. So we'll take a look at it in the spring to see what happens after this year, because there's going to be close to 60,000 cubic feet per second coming out of Gavins Point Dam for an extended amount of time this summer. So we're in a high flow year, and we'll take a look in the spring and see how much the flows we're seeing this year caused the delta to move forward. So also an interesting thing is that during normal flows, the Niobrara River is certainly the most significant contributor of sand to the delta. But during high flows, the Missouri River actually becomes the most significant contributor of flows to the delta. So it's bringing, through bed erosion and so on, it's bringing sands and silts from further upstream and pushing them into the delta. And it's really the flows in the Missouri that are the power behind what's pushing the delta then further into the lake. So high flow years definitely see a much higher rate of degradation to the system than normal flow years. The reservoir has lost about 1/3 of its storage capacity so far. And another corollary effect is the groundwater levels. So groundwater levels are expected to increase an average of 7 feet in the delta area in the next 50 years, impacting infrastructure and property. So 7 feet over 50 years, not 7 feet a year. But that's significant. So if the water table raises 7 feet 50 years from now, think about what that does to houses and so on that are built on the floodplain close to the river. Also, I want to point out, as part of some of the work that we have been doing, Dr. Dixon and his crew, at the same time we're doing vegetation surveys to see just what is this delta made of anyway for vegetation. And what they found is that basically the lower part of the delta is primarily Phragmites. So Phragmites has basically taken over this lower part of the delta. And it's, for those of you that have been out there in the lower part, you know this is what the scene looks like. It's very tall. We lost a grad student out there. We're still looking for him. But the bad thing about Phragmites is that the dominant vegetation, it's the dominant vegetation, and it spreads very aggressively. It grows quickly, and if there's any bare sand out there at all, it colonizes it very quickly. When we were doing work out here after the 2011 flood, we saw huge flats of sandbars that were making up the delta, and that was in around June or so. Then we go back in October of that same year, and most of those sandbars were gone. They looked like this because the Phragmites had colonized so fast. And it crowds out native wetland plants, and so you don't have this diversity of plants in the delta anymore. And if you want to know more about that, Dr. Dixon over here with USD Biology can tell you all about that. So in terms of what might the Lewis and Clark look like in the future, and this is basically just designed to be a few slides that give us a visual of the obvious, and that is the lake filling with sediment. And this is based on sedimentation rates and progression rates that are published in various reports that the Corps of Engineers has had other types of consulting firms do for them over the last 10 years or so. So in 2013, the front of the delta looked like this. If we fast forward 50 years, the front of the delta would look like something like this. It would be past the Bonham colony. 100 years from now, it's basically impacting the Wygon area, the big state park area on the Nebraska side. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we're showing a visual delta front here. This is what you can see from the air. But what you don't see is out ahead of this some distance, there's a lot of impact as well. So out ahead of this, the lake is getting shallower. It's filling up with silt below the water, making it more turbid and making it much less usable than it normally should be. And then 150 years into the future, basically we have a sediment front very near the dam. And that actually fits pretty well with what the expected lifetime was of Lewis and Clark Lake. So as an example, though, I alluded earlier to sedimentation problems kind of creeping up on you slowly, and before you know it, it's a major problem. And that's really what we're seeing here with this delta. But the Niobrara, the town of Niobrara, really was the first one out of the chute to really experience these problems. And the town of Niobrara used to sit down on a terrace deposit just above the river. So it was a little bit above the river, not a lot above the river, but basically sat just north of Highway 12. And once the sediment started building in the 60s and the early 70s, what it was doing was it was raising that water table that I talked about earlier. And it raised it to the point that the town of Niobrara was having serious water table problems. So basements were continually full of water and so on, because this water table had come up, not like it has this year, like around here it's been really wet, the water table's up, people have water in their basements, but that'll go away with some dry weather. This was a 365-day a year, every year problem for them. The water table had come up permanently because of the aggradation of the riverbed with all that sediment. And so in the mid-70s, the town of Niobrara had to move high up onto the bluff south of Highway 12. And this is a picture of that move in progress. You can see the river back here. You can see where the old town in Niobrara was, sort of on this terrace deposit. And then you can see the streets of the new town being built, and then the new town eventually moved up to where that street network is at. Niobrara State Park had the same fate. They used to be down on an island in the Niobrara River, just north of Highway 12, and and so the sedimentation also affects the lower part of the Niobrara River. It's dropping a lot of sand there because of the aggradation that's going on in here in the delta as well. And so it's also, the water table is coming up in this area as well. And so Niobrara State Park had problems with that rising water table and had to move their structures from this island in the Niobrara River way up on top of the bluff where they are today. So I just wanted to acknowledge some of the work that we've been doing has been funded by the Missouri Sedimentation Action Coalition. The work's done under the umbrella of the USD Missouri River Institute, and some of my colleagues that have been doing a lot of this work are Dr. Mark Sweeney, Dr. Mark Dixon, and Dr. Jeff Wesner, all with USD.
In preparation for my visit, I spoke with John Remus from the Omaha District of the Corps. I've known John for a long time. We had some real significant conversations. And one of the things I asked him was, John, this feasibility study that's being offered up here requires a local match. As a matter of fact, 50% of the cost needs to be incurred locally. I said, John, why is that? The federal government caused the problem. And he said, well, you know, the age of earmarks is over. And if it had not been over, then this could have been an earmarked project with 100% of the funds coming from the federal government. But because the age of earmarks is over, projects that are sponsored by the Corps now require a local match. So please keep that in mind. And in a little while in this meeting, we'll talk about how that might happen. What I'd like to do now is kind of give you a big picture, including a little bit on economic analysis, to help us all understand why we are in the position we are right now. So let me go forward with that. Sediment management at dams is a much more active topic outside the United States than here at home because of necessity. In China, the Yellow River is called the Yellow River because of the silt load it carries. And if you build a dam on the Yellow River, you must pass sediment downstream or you're not going to have any water storage. In the Swiss Alps, coarse grained sediment comes down each year from glaciers and snowmelt. And if you don't pass sediment downstream, you're not going to have a reservoir. So I've been fortunate enough to visit many of these places and learn more about it. I was just in Japan 2 weeks ago, where I learned one of the things they do in that steep mountainous country is they drill a tunnel through the mountain around the reservoir. Then at the upper end of the reservoir during a flood, they'll capture the water and sediment and put it through the tunnel. A tunnel much larger than this room. And that sediment-laden water goes through the tunnel, rejoins the river downstream, preserving storage capacity. That's not really an option here, but it certainly was interesting to see that in Japan, where they actually have to do that. Elsewhere in Japan, they'll use a few techniques I'll mention in a moment. But I want to address motivation. Why are people worldwide managing sediment at reservoirs? Because they have to. It's not because they sat down in a room and said, let's do the right thing. Let's keep that sediment moving for the ecosystems downstream. Let's keep it moving so there's no damages upstream. That's not why they manage sediment down at the dam. They manage sediment to preserve the objectives of the dam itself: flood control, hydroelectricity, water supply, etc. But whatever the motivation, they're doing it. So, what can be done? You can prevent sediment from entering the reservoir. That's watershed treatment. That's always a good idea. But remember, the Niobrara drains the sand hills. Sand hills. So that's not going to solve things here. You can pass sediment through without deposition. I'll talk about that for a moment. Or you can mobilize sediments that have been deposited and move them somewhere, or move into the Missouri River downstream. So, what's this look like? For watershed protection, you can increase vegetation upstream. I don't see this as a long-term solution for Gavins Point because of the geology that we have up here. You can increase sediment storage by building more storage structures upstream. On the tributaries, you could build little dams, large dams, on all the tributaries coming in. You've seen the numbers that Tim presented. Less than 30% of the sediment is coming in from tributaries. You can do thousands of small gully plugs. This was successfully done on the Yellow River. Tens of thousands of gully plugs, 2 meters high, 6 feet, were put in by local folks. Why did that work? 2 reasons. They had 1 million people to work with. And they told the farmers that if you put in a gully plug here, when it fills with silt, you can farm it and keep the income from the produce. So that worked. You can build more dams. Now, what's being done, like in Sudan, other developing countries, when they have a problem like we face here, they just make the dam higher. And that kicks the can down the road another generation. That's what they've been doing. These things don't always work. How about passing sediment downstream? Good friend of mine, George Annandale, gives me this. I showed this video 2 years ago. This is in Japan. This is one of those sediment bypass tunnels. This is the Miwa Dam, and we are looking upstream at the dam. This is the main part of the dam over here. The outlet of the tunnel is right over here. This is really muddy water. You can see it even looks a little bit thicker. This is where that tunnel comes out. This is kind of an information item. It's not viable here, but that's being done, and there's actual conferences on this around the world. That's what their river looks like when the sediment is being passed downstream. So keep the sediment, don't even let it deposit in the reservoir. Somehow get it around the dam. That's the idea. Now, once you have deposits in a reservoir, what can you do? And we use terms like these that somehow are related and sometimes confusing. Sluicing, flushing, dredging. So sluicing under pressure is actually done at several locations here in the United States. Cherry Creek Reservoir down in Denver. They do this 3 or 4 times a year. In that case, the fine-grained sediment has gone right up against the dam and threatens to clog the outlet works. No good. So several times a year, they open those outlet works, and that scours the sediment around from that local area. It's very local. This is best shown in a laboratory setting. This is a laboratory flume. This is a bed of sediment, and there's a dam right there. So if you open up a low-level outlet, did you see how quickly that came out?
Can you shut the lights off above your head? Thank you.
So the bed looked like this before. Now it looks like this. Completely removes the sediment, but it's very local in nature. That is not an option at Gavins Point for 2 reasons. 1, there isn't a lot of sediment right at the dam. Number 2, there's no low-level outlets. Can't do that. Okay. How about at Spencer Dam? This is called flushing. Looking upstream at Spencer Dam, here's the old powerhouse. Here are the gates. In this case, this is a harbinger of Gavins Point. You want to see what Gavins Point will look like in the future? Drive on down to Spencer Dam. It's full. And the gates here are opened quite slowly, and they pass sediment downstream. The day that I measured bed load transport on the Niobrara, it was 2,000 tons per day. Added up, that's about 50 million tons of sediment has entered the lake behind Gavins Point since they closed the dam. But this is an effective way to move sediment downstream if the dam is full. They no longer have they don't have low-level outlets either. But the sediment filled up right to the gates. Now, eventually, if Gavins Point fills up right to the gates, then they can open the gates and away it goes. This is standing on the dam looking upstream. Paul Boyd loaned me this photograph. It's a dangerous place to be. I've measured the bathymetry in this reservoir myself, both before and after these sluicing events. And it's not a place you want to be during that. These sands shift in seconds, and it can be a really dangerous place to be. But it is really inexpensive. Okay, I'm going to explain this figure. I'll take a few minutes to explain it. In engineering, when we don't understand a problem very well, what we do is we gather data that's been observed from around the world, and we make a plot on axes we think are important. And when it comes to sediment management around the world, this is the plot that we use. On this x-axis is a ratio of storage capacity, like 450,000 acre-feet in the case upstream from Gavins Point, divided by the mean annual river runoff. That's how much water is coming downstream. Now, when I look at this axis, I like to take the inverse, because the inverse is how many times the reservoir can fill with water each year. When we go upstream on the Missouri and we get to Garrison Reservoir, for example, that is so huge that out here it takes 3 years to fill the reservoir once with water. This point right here represents Gavins Point. And this number is about 0.02, which means that you can fill that reservoir maybe 50 times a year with water, because there's so much water coming downstream. Now, on the y-axis, this vertical line here is another ratio. And that ratio is storage capacity, again, the same number, like 450,000 acre-feet, divided by the annual sediment load. So this is like how many years it's going to take to fill the reservoir with sediment. Here's Gavins Point, and that's plotting at about 170 years. So we've got that point there. Now I'll explain what else is on the graph. This word flushing, sluicing, and storage. Over here, for like Garrison and for Hoover Dam and our largest dams in the United States that have so much storage behind them, you really can't do a thing. You can't do anything, because the sediment drops out maybe 150 miles upstream from the dam. So you're just out of luck. Now, as our dams get smaller and we're able to fill them more frequently each year, we can afford to draw the water level down and use some of that sediment to water to move sediment. This is sluicing, where the reservoir is not emptied. The water level is lowered but not emptied. And this is flushing, where the water level is lowered all the way, and you're back to an open river condition. And Gavins Point falls right in this area right here. So when we don't understand all the complexities of something in engineering, we go with experience like this. So what was done? You already know this. A study was done about the possibility of flushing or sluicing at Gavins Point. Before the study was begun, I told Paul, you already know the answer to this. I know the answer to this. You can't do it because the gates are not low enough. They're not at the bottom of the dam. And in order to move sediment downstream, you've got to get it up off the bottom of the reservoir in order to go over the gates. It's like sitting in your house and you've got to get sand from the floor through your window. Well, that doesn't happen. Nonetheless, they did a lot of work on this. And this is the problem at Gavins Point. And I'll talk in a minute why that's the case. Why is this? I'll talk about that. Clays and silts will flush, sand will not. And at least they said they should consider modifying the dam. Do we have the political will to do so? In Japan, 2 weeks ago, they did on the Mimikawa River. They're modifying the Yamasubaru Dam and the Saigo Dam, lowering gates to move sediment downstream. They do it in China on the Sanmenxia Dam. They added gates. They gave up hydropower to move sediment downstream. Technically, it can be done. Do we have the willpower to do it? That's the question. Okay. All right, now this is a kind of an unusual one. We can probably turn a light back on. I don't think there's any more videos, and I feel a little uncomfortable in the dark because I can't see you. There, thank you. In a paper that I helped Howard publish in 2009, we came up with kind of a crazy idea, but it can be done. Right now, this may be the most viable alternative for Gavins Point. Requires no dam modification. It requires about 50 years to complete. A 50-year-long project. Well, that's too long, people say. Well, here we are, 50 years after the dam was closed, worried about it. So, no, it's not too long. 4 phases is what we proposed. One is to move sediment within the reservoir. Take some of that deltaic sand and move it into the deeper portions of the reservoir, creating a channel, a clearly defined channel through that deposited sediment for the sand to be transported. Then second phase, maintain that lower bed. Third phase, top that relocated sand with silt. And that kind of leaves it there permanently, not going anywhere. And then begin to move sand past the dam in a pipe. Well, that would be expensive, people say. Yes, it would. And then pass all sand via pipeline past the dam, maybe dropping it back into the Missouri River a couple of miles downstream, because immediately downstream there's a great fishery, and you don't want to mess that up. We did a benefit-cost ratio. It penciled out. So if that's the good news, what's the bad news about what Howard and I dreamed up? Technologically, we can't do phase 1. It's impossible today. We do not have the technology to move massive amounts of sand downstream underwater in an inexpensive way. We can't do it yet. That requires the invention of some new technology. Okay, so in any event, what I want you to remember is that this is another big picture idea. The videos that I showed, the anecdotes that I shared, they're all big picture stuff. Now, as we listened to stakeholders a few minutes ago, not one of you mentioned big picture. You did not mention, let's clear it out. Let's move sediment downstream from Gavins Point. Let's restore a sediment balance across the dam. You brought up concerns of a local nature. Now, to you, that's a big problem, and I agree that's a big problem. But it's big with lowercase b. What I've been talking about is big, all caps, because this is system-wide. This is what you do. But what are you interested in? You're interested in local impacts. Please keep that in mind, and we'll come back to that in just a little while. So this is how our dam building legacy in the United States has worked. If we don't do anything, we know what's going to happen. But we'd like to have intergenerational, we've got right now intergenerational inequity. In other words, you'd like to pass that deed for your marina to your grandchildren. Well, it will be full of sediment. Is that what you want to give them? That's called intergenerational inequity. Don't want that to happen. So the first generation, at least in the history of our country, comes up with the idea of a dam, and they plan it, they design, and they build it. The second generation, they start receiving the benefits, whether it be recreation, hydro, ag water, anything. They begin repaying capital costs and operation and maintenance. That's what O&M stands for, operation and maintenance. The third generation continues receiving benefits, repaying capital costs, and paying O&M. The fourth generation pays O&M, but not for sediment. The final generation gets the bill. And this is the problem. We haven't solved this problem. We haven't. And it's frustrating to me to see hundreds of dams being built around the world. And they're all using the same path that we have used. Why is that? It's because when we build a dam, somehow we treat nature as a business commodity. And that's not generally a good idea when dealing with natural processes. I'll explain this graph here. This is time, this is right now, or let's go back with Gavins Point, let's say it's 1955, okay? The dam was closed, built in 1955. Now we go out in time, and here we are 63 years later. When a dam is built, this is the expectation. On the bottom, the red stuff are expenses, and the blue stuff is income. They anticipated at Gavins Point a pretty steady revenue from hydro, recreation, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, there was a big capital cost, the construction of the dam, and then there's some operation and maintenance costs every year. This is how it's envisioned. The problem is, let's say you want to build a dam, but you've got several ideas. For example, in this room, if we said, hey, let's build another dam, we might come up with 5 different ideas, 5 different locations, 5 different heights, 5 different kinds of dams. One has hydro, the other doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. How do you compare this stuff? Back in the 1930s, a plan was hatched in the United States that has become policy, enforced by the Office of Management and Budget. That procedure is called the benefit-cost ratio. And if you've got multiple alternatives for the same project, you do this that I've shown on the screen for every one of those alternatives. And then by using some mathematics, you convert all future costs and benefits back to present value. And with all costs and benefits at present value, you can compare. Well, this alternative is going to cost $50 million. Kyle's alternative is going to cost $500 million. Well, okay, we've got something to compare. Now, here's the devil in this detail. Interest rate, the time value of money. We all understand it. I've got a savings account now in a bank whose name I shall not mention. It gets about 0.1% interest per year. Okay, let's do some math. I want to ask the question. So you take your child or your grandchild and you say, what is the value of 50 years into the future if you gave your grandchild a nickel today? How much would that be worth in 50 years? Let's assume an interest rate of 7%. 7%. That's pretty high. In 50 years, using this fancy formula right here, that nickel is worth $1.47. That's why I want my children to save for retirement when they're young. Please start now, okay? Well, it can go backwards. We can do this backwards. And we can say, if I had $1.47 50 years from now, what would it be worth today with an interest rate of 7%? Well, it works perfectly well backwards and forwards, and you can guess that $1.47 50 years in the future brought back to present value would equal a nickel. That's the problem right there. I am told, I cannot confirm this, but I am told that putting in low-level outlets at Gavins Point was probably considered, but found to be too expensive. Why? Because they may not receive benefit from those low-level outlets for, say, 30 years. And the monetary benefit from something that far into the future, when brought back to a present value, is so small. It's really small. But the expense of putting in low-level outlets at Gavins Point when they built the dam, that's a cost in today's dollars. That's real. This is the problem. It was a technique envisioned to compare alternatives. The unintended consequence is, and continues to be around the world, that when we build a dam, it is not sustainable. And it's because of this right here. So now I'm going to show you a few graphs, and I'll explain what the graphs are, but this is about the impact of this interest rate. Here is the x-axis right here. In this case, it's discount rate. That's the interest rate that's charged on a loan for building a dam. Starts at 0 and goes all the way to 16%. And on this axis here is the present value of $1 50 years in the future. For example, if we have an interest rate of 2.75%, $1 from the future brought back to the present is worth 25 cents. 25 cents at an interest rate of 2.75%. Now, if the interest rate is 7%, then it's worth a nickel. So the discount rate, the interest on the loan, is really, really important. We treat nature like a commodity, like a business, and we start putting interest rates on things. Here's another one. This is the discount rate, again in percent. This is 2% going all the way up to 15%. And this time on the y-axis, how long does it take to make that money nearly worthless? In other words, if I have $1 and I bring it back to present value, it's only a nickel. How many years does that take? Well, if the interest rate is very high, then that money is devalued very quickly. So what does that mean in the US? What discount rates are actually used? The discount rate here in the United States is set by law every year. And in 2018, the interest rate is 2.75%. Now, I remember when I bought my first house, the interest rate on my house loan was about 12 to 14%. Perfectly bad timing for a young couple. But we survived. We made it. But right now, it's about 2.75%. What about around the world? World Bank, they loan money to developing countries to build dams and other projects. Their average is 11.23%. That's about over 74 countries. Look at the range. The range is from 4.3 to 47%. How would you like to pay 47%? That's almost like a credit card, right? This discount rate, it is tough. I have a responsibility on the Environmental Advisory Board for the Corps of Engineers. A group of 10 of us from around the country report directly to the chief, which makes it kind of an influential position that we're in. I remember talking to people from OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, one day. I talk to them, I protect their identities so they're anonymous. That way I can have open conversations with them. And I ask them, what's the chances of getting the interest rate changed or lowered or decreased over time? And they literally laughed at me. I don't like it when people laugh at me. It takes an act of Congress to change this. Now, 2.75%, well, that's pretty low. But let me show you the next graph. I showed you this one earlier. This is how many dams have been built in the United States by decade. Up here is the interest rate charged in the United States over time. And I've placed this so it matches. So we built our first home right about in here, where the interest rate charged by the federal government was about 7%. By a bank, it was double that. So here's the interest rate that has been used to build water projects in the United States. Gavins Point, 1955, right in here. The interest rate doesn't show. It was low. It was less than 3%. Still, with an interest rate that low, it doesn't pencil out to spend money today whose benefits may not be realized for 30 years. We're facing another issue called climate change. Now, if the oceans of the world rise 3 feet, Miami's got a problem. And they can't wait for that water to rise 3 feet to fix it. They have to start investing money now for a benefit that won't be realized for 50 years. They're really struggling with this idea. Okay, there are some other shortcomings of the benefit cost. For some reason, damages like you have faced, continue to face, and will face are not included in that benefit cost analysis. For example, and this was mentioned in the introduction by Mark, whoever wrote that did a very good job, because they detailed something in this journal paper I recently published. If you consider only the damages that have been paid out upstream of Gavins Point, they account for about 70% of the construction cost of the dam. Downstream damages, likely higher, but I don't know what they are. Okay, so if you, and in this slide, this is again one of those real big picture things. If you want to move towards sustainability, then tack on, excuse me, tack on some additional capital costs right here. Build those low-level outlets. Because if you don't, your benefit string decreases, your O&M increases. This is like a timeline of my life. I mean, as I get older, my productivity goes down, but the O&M on my body goes up. And the same is true for dams. So we can change it. Add a little bit more cost right here, maintain that revenue string, keep your O&M lower. This is sustainability. This is big picture stuff, okay? And you'll say, well, that's just great. But our problems tend to be local. What are we going to do here? And that's going to be what we talk about next in this meeting. Because what I've done here is a big picture summary, capital B-I-G. The big picture is for you is solving some local problems with sediment. Big without the capital B. Now, for this study that's coming up, you've got to be sure and include the local issues. The Corps is not likely to do that. The Corps, when they come up with their imaginative solutions, it'll be capital B-I-G. It's up to you to make sure that as each of you spoke and said, we're with you, we're supportive, we're behind you, that this study include actions on a local scale. Okay, now for those of you who are representing our congressional delegations, there's something else that needs to happen after this meeting is over, and that is, please don't give up. It's a big issue, but don't give up. Here are some things that need to be done. For example, right here, do you know why the Corps simply buys land upstream when damaged by sediment? Because it's the least cost alternative. And real estate law that they are obliged to follow constrains them to do that. They're not going to solve the problem. They're just going to buy land. Don't you hate the Corps? As has been said earlier, they are simply doing what they're constrained to do by law. So, needs to be addressed. So, there's a technical part, there's a political part as usual to all of this. And Sandy and Mark, I think that's all I had for the PowerPoint. And can we flip the other light on? What questions do you have that I might address before we go to something else? Yes?
Why do they keep allowing Pier, someone in this area, keep allowing them to build in these areas? They say, no, you can't. And do they get waivers? I mean, why in the world did they allow them to build on those sandbars?
That's a question for local zoning boards. It happens all over the country.
Can't the federal government put a stop to that?
No, they can only require that you purchase flood insurance. If a house is built here and it's in the 100-year floodplain, you must buy flood insurance in order to occupy that home. That's the only role the federal government has in locating houses. Everything else is up to local developers and zoning boards. So look to your county, to your city, because that's where the action is there. Good question. Yes?
Raleigh, you're aware, I assume, that the estimates by the Department of Transportation in Nebraska are that it will cost between $200 and $300 million to relocate Highway 12 or remedy the situation with respect to Highway 12.
That's right.
How do you take that expenditure into account when those dollars will be United States government dollars, because the United States is responsible for remedying the damage they've caused in that area? And I guess my question is twofold. When you get to the match with respect to this project coming up, since the government caused the problem, why don't they just pay for the study?
Right.
Why should independent stakeholders be responsible for coming up with a solution that the government caused in the first place?
Okay, I'll answer that question first. I mentioned earlier it's because the era of earmarks is over. Earlier, 15 years ago, the federal government could have paid for the whole thing. But now earmarks are over. And I'm surprised, frankly, that you've got Section 1179A. But all projects of this nature now require a local cost match by law. I asked John Remus that exact question, and that's what he told me. Now, as to your first question, how do you account for $200 million to relocate Highway 12? The question is, could they have anticipated that in 1955 when they built the dam? They knew there was going to be problems at Niobrara. They knew that Niobrara would eventually have to be relocated. This was not a secret. Did they know about Highway 12? If they did, they didn't include it in the cost benefit. As I mentioned, damages are not included in the cost benefit. It's a weakness, and the implications are what we face now. Does that help? Well, it sure is. Yeah. Okay. Other questions?
Well, what is the cost going to be? What's our share?
50%.
No, I get that. What are we talking
Okay,
about?
here's what the feasibility study looks like. It really sounds kind of funny when you first hear it. It's called by the Corps 3x3x3. What does that mean? The feasibility study can take no more than 3 years, because some of them were taking 10 years. And you lose interest by fatigue. So it's got to be completed within 3 years. It can cost no more than $3 million, which seems like a lot. And the final report can be no more than 3 inches high. Some of the reports were this high, several feet high. Well, so that's where the phrase comes from. The cost of this study, undetermined. Sandy has a ballpark figure, but I don't know if you want to make that public or not.
Well, we've talked about it. In general, the Corps said that it shouldn't cost anywhere near $3 million because of the amount of research that has already been done. Part of the process at the beginning would be scoping out of how big a project would this entail. And it sounds like it can be broken down into 2 phases. With the first phase, you can really look at what are our alternatives and get a ballpark idea of how we're going to get there before you get into phase 2, where you would actually look at the environmental and economic type scenarios with specific paths to take. So a stakeholder group could fund phase 1, and if the results are not what was anticipated, or maybe they're not a player in phase 2. But phase 1 really brings the information together. It'll be a smaller ticket item, dollar-wise. Theoretically, it should cost less than $500,000. Phase 1 is kind of the ballpark that's been talked about.
Let me go back to Richard's question. Why should there be a local match required if the problem was made by the federal government? You told us that you've got farmland underwater. That's not your fault. No. And I'm not sure that you gain benefit from the construction of Gavins Point.
Not for a long time.
Yeah. The other stakeholders that spoke this morning all have benefited by the fact that Gavins Point is there. Tourism dollars, everything. You've all benefited by the fact that the dam and lake is there. Richard, that hints that some local skin might be in the game to continue to receive those benefits that otherwise would not be received.
One of the things that's concerning with that argument is that when this system was put in place, all of the people that were going to be affected by the Missouri River main stem system were sold in part on the benefits from recreation. And now you're saying somehow or other they're not going to count that because we've relied. I don't mean you personally, but somehow or other that isn't a factor that seems to carry much weight.
I'm not saying that, okay? The Corps, they wear handcuffs of different kinds. The handcuffs that they wear on the Missouri is that they need to follow the master manual. And there are some authorized purposes for having these dams in place. Those purposes they must follow. So they're constrained a little bit that way. But the main reason that there's a local match required, as I've explained, is that's the way it is on all projects now, all of them, around the country, for any purpose.
In your opinion, could the master manual be changed so that the dams could be operated to generate greater income?
Could the master manual be changed to generate greater income? Yes.
How much?
I don't know. And it depends on who you ask and the color of money. The master manual was changed not too long ago, and you folks were involved in that. The recreational benefits in South and North Dakota, as opposed to the navigational benefits downstream. Navigation income was dropping. Recreation in North and South Dakota, higher every year. I've fished for salmon above pier. What are salmon doing up? Well, I don't care. It's fun to fish for them. So the master manual was changed, so it can be changed.
Yeah, one thing the upstream states should just do, that master manual is way overweight for the navigation traffic.
Right.
And they don't care. In the old days, that was built so farmers and agriculture commodities had an alternative to the railroads, because it was before the interstate and everything else. So the railroads had a lock on moving bulk commodities over long distances, and river transportation was the option, and they subsidized that. Well, nowadays, that's a fraction. There is bulk cargo going down the river, but you go over to Point Neal in Sioux City and you see how much barge traffic is coming up. Very little. Go in South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, put an extra $1 tax on every fishing license and every boat license. Take all that money, go down to St. Louis and buy the barge industry. Take those barges up on dry dock, cut them up with a plasma arc, and then we can have a recreation where it should be.
Is that your real opinion, Don, or So yes, it can be changed. Here are a couple of facts that you might find interesting that I've found out about the Corps. They have more than 400 dams around the country and recreation at most of those where they collect user fees. They have more visits at the Corps projects than all of the national parks combined in the United States. And do you know how much the Corps can keep from collecting all that money? Not a penny. It all goes to the general treasury. Think of what could happen if that money were retained locally. Kyle, get the picture? They generate electricity at Gavins Point. I am told that it's not a lot of electricity, relatively speaking. But nationwide, the Corps produces a lot of electricity, hydropower. They collect a lot of money for that. Do you know how much they can keep? Do you get the idea? Zero. All the money goes to the general treasury. Imagine what could be done locally if the money generated were kept here, Senator. So there's a couple other things that can be changed. Okay, are there other questions before we get into our group discussion? Yes, please.
An additional comment, one of the things that maybe many people aren't aware of also that the Corps is looking at doing, and you're probably aware of, is they're looking at charging for putting even more salt into the wounds of the people who lost property the state was promised use of the Missouri River for the life of the Missouri River. Now the Corps is looking at charging for water stored in those impoundments to users like BY Water or Cedar Knox or anybody that pulls water from an impoundment. They're looking at charging for that water that's stored, even though that the states were promised the right to use that water for eternity.
Yeah, this is kind of a recent development in our country. It's called the Beneficiary Pays Principle, BPP. It's a way to eke out more income. Yeah, that would be adding salt to the wounds. Okay, so now the question is, what would you like to see happen? Before our meeting began, I tried to meet each one of you. I didn't make it, but I made it around a lot of the room. And I asked you to think of 3 questions. One is, what would you like to see happen? 2, what benefits would happen if what you want to see happen happens? And 3, who else would benefit from your idea? So I'd like to throw that question out and then just open the floor for comments from any or all of you. My purpose in coming today is not to share a bunch of technical detail with you, but to make sure each of you leaves feeling that you've been listened to. So what do you have to say?
Yes, this study should be completed and the costs identified and the feasibility determined, and then the cost-benefit ratio should be changed by Congress so that it can be appropriately addressed to the loss of recreation, the loss of the reservoir, all of the intangible benefits that will be lost eventually if nothing is done, so that the cost-benefit ratio, changed appropriately, can measure correctly the benefits to accrue from a feasible solution to the problem. Those are the two things I'd like to see.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Don?
You spent an awful lot of time this morning telling us the big picture. But you never gave us the big political picture. And the big political picture that I witnessed for 50 years is two questions. One is, how does the Pixlone project relate to navigation on the Mississippi River?
And that's one. You held up two fingers.
Well, just think about that a second. Because every time I've gotten crosswise with some congressional delegation, being an employee of our congressional delegation, I run up against members of Congress from Missouri that really don't give a damn about the Mississippi or Missouri, except for makeup water that they count on for the Mississippi. Question number two, why is it any longer necessary to have a navigation season based on 1944 assumptions? The guys came home from Europe, they won the war in Europe, they won the war in Japan, they came back, they planted fence row to fence row, but they didn't produce a bumper crop and didn't ship it overseas on barges. So all of the economic and social underpinnings of the 1944 Act of the Pixlone Project never materialized. So if we could just, in my mind, recognize that we no longer need a navigation system, we wouldn't be pushing loads of sediment down that get dropped and deposited in areas we don't need.
Don, I can't answer either one of your questions. I mean, I won't pretend to. But I feel like I'm in a Star Trek episode where I'm the engineer. Was that Scotty?
Well, I feel like the cowboy that went to the barn dance and had one boot nailed to the floor.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And that's why in my last slide, I emphasized the political aspect of this. Now, I've got a suggestion, a very specific suggestion for you. I guess within 30 days, Sandy, you'll have another meeting. Invite people from Missouri, because if you don't, they will object to anything that is proposed because they weren't invited to the table. Get it out, Don. Get it out. Get them involved now. Listen, see what happens, because if you don't, they'll object. There's more people down there than here. Yes?
This is back to a procedural question. Okay, let's just assume the study is completed and we have a great plan. We got a big picture solution. Yeah. How does it get implemented? Yeah. Do we just say, okay, start digging tomorrow? What's the process that would have to ensue?
As I understand it, once this report is done and recommendations are made, two steps are left. One is authorization, which Congress does fairly readily. The other is money. It's a two-step process, and they don't necessarily occur at the same time. That's all I can tell you.
I would say, just to add on to that, with the discussion with the Corps, is that we've been the first entity to inquire about Section 1179A, and if we're first in line with a plan of sustainability for a reservoir, and then there's money available to do that, that puts our locality in a greater position because we're steps ahead of other places.
Frank?
Just a comment.
Or Howard,
for your
sorry.
question. When we got the Mini-Washoni project authorized in 1988, we were told by Dan Beard, who at that time was the head guy of the House Water and Resources Committee, working for Congressman George Smith. Don't get excited. You've been authorized, that's easy. At that time, there were over 700 water projects authorized by Congress that had never received a nickel. Authorization isn't that difficult. But when it comes down to getting money, you got to remember that you're battling every other congressional district in the United States for that money, the same buck. So it's not going to be an easy haul, but it's got to be done.
I think some of that can be used to our advantage too, and that we're kind of the guinea pig of sorts, I guess. And there's other places around the country that have these issues, so there's positives in that too.
Yes. I apologize because I'm new to this group, but the question going through my mind is, what is it that we are going to study? Are we studying ending sedimentation growth in the lake? Are we studying removal of sedimentation that's already there in the lake? What is it that we're actually looking to accomplish here?
Let me suggest two things that you're looking to accomplish. One, and this is the big picture, and this is what the Corps is going to be looking at, how to get this sediment moving on downstream. And that's a really big picture. But the other is your marinas and opposite the, what's the name? Devil's?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a local issue. The marina, all other issues are local. So two things, local protection and resolution, long-term resolution, and the big picture, getting this thing moving. That's what I think we'll be looking at.
Doesn't the rule also, the cost-benefit rule, require locality? And couldn't that be something that could be changed in the cost-benefit formula?
I'm sorry, Richard, I don't know. Yes?
Has there been any thought to first trying to reduce the amount of sediment first and then work on a solution? I mean, you said that technology to get all of the sediment down really doesn't exist at this point. And I guess I would encourage the use of like conservation techniques in that area. And myself on the James River water, we've had a lot of success with small buffer strips, small earthen dams. If we can reduce the amount of sediment by 50% going in there, we doubled the life of that, and now maybe we have time to study it more and work on a solution. Has there been any thought about that? I mean, you can't get any cheaper or more affordable than planting some grass.
It sounds like it's happening in your area. I can't answer your question.
Sure, I think the other project that's managed by James River.
South Central Watershed.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of success in the Choctaw Creek and up in Chamberlain area doing just that with stream exclusions and so.
And we've talked about that, and I think it's been better than it has been decades ago. And that's part of what sediment collectors would address. Is we're trying to find ways to reduce what's coming in, so you have a smaller problem to deal with. But the sustainability of it, we'll need to have other things like modify the dam or what have you. So, but no, I think that can be part of a sediment management plan. Ideally, Rollin, correct me if I'm wrong, but a plan hopefully would move towards sustainability, but different components of that plan could be maybe bank stabilization, since so much of the Missouri River above Niobrara is contributing to the problem as well. So it's not going to be one thing that probably would be started in the short term.
Yeah, I think like a holistic approach with
Yeah.
different areas, and I think conservation is a very important
And
part.
I think that's exactly what this phase 1 of section 1179A would do, is the stakeholders have an active role in it as well. It's not give a check to the Corps and then they come back with the report a year and a half later. The stakeholders will be involved with it throughout the process.
So have a diverse portfolio of ideas. I think that would be to your advantage. Yes?
Just address briefly what he had questioned there as far as we do have practices reducing, trying to keep cattle off the edge of the banks. We've got different things in place up and down, in Nebraska that reduces that. Anymore, our biggest times is at major rain events. You can just pretty much, you just take your aerials and watch, okay, if you've had a big rain event, you'll see a flush of sediment, but most of the time it's very minimal. It's usually after a major rain event that we have the issues. And the second thing I want to mention, and I don't want to be the one sticking the stick in the spokes here, but I will tell you what happened as far as our rural water system that we have. We went, the Bureau of Reclamation had this regional water supply money and grants that they were coming out with, and they were going to create all these new regional water supply systems, and we were the first one in. We got our feasibility study in, and then we got to the second step of that, and we got just about to the end of that, and for some reason California ended up with a drought, and all of the funds that were earmarked for that particular projects or those projects, it all went away and went out to California. In fact, it took us 2 years to get the last payment from them because they didn't have any money in that anymore. So just because they have these programs, they're great. Yeah, let's get in on the ground. Hopefully they keep going, but beware that those things can happen, and that's what we need our congressional people to keep those things from happening.
Yep. What else can we do but move forward, right? Comment.
Ron, just one last thing, and this meeting today was great. It was wonderful to see all you people here, but what we need is everybody to be stakeholders, big or small. We've got NRDs, we've got tribes, we've got villages, we've got towns, we've got cities, and we've got state and federal government. If we don't all work together with this, we're not going to get anywhere. We don't have big voting blocks in the Midwest. We don't have the millions of people like Southern California that's going to take the money and move it. We need to work as Missouri, what Rollin says, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. We need to form together to get this as a priority. So please, if we can stick together on this, we've got a much better chance than Sandy and I calling us one senator and voicing our thing, what we're talking about. That's all well and good, but if we can get 10 senators, we've got a whole lot more clout. So let's everybody work together on it.
The clock is running on this. Let me just thank you for your attention. And it's been my dream for some time that in my career, I might be able to positively affect change. And it's taking my entire career. But this is the best chance perhaps that we've had so far. Please keep the faith and keep moving ahead. Thank you for your attendance.